Before the Civil Rights Act in 1964, African American status, economically and socially, had been compromised by the effects of Southern oppression, racism, and segregation. However, the Civil Rights Movement, which was kickstarted by people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., raised question about the treatment of minorities, who were declared free under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Some major turning points or changes for civil rights of women and blacks were the nonviolent movement with Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X's black separatism movement, and Betty Friedan's argument for the cult of domesticity. Some continuities throughout the time period of civil reform were the overall fight in identifying the extent of racial and gender acceptance, whether it would be assimilation or diversity. Therefore, the economic issues of racism stopped after the passing of this legislation and gave no private or public company license to hire based on race. Hence, all blacks and women were given equal opportunities as white males within the workforce. However, the caveat is that even though minorities are protected legally from the government, some people still remain stubborn and do not accept certain minorities as socially equal. Social equality is a progressing concept that keeps improving over time. Before the passage of legislation in the 1960s, the African Americans didn't have any potential for economic improvement due to the terrible situations like sharecropping, the KKK, and Jim Crow laws. Sharecropping was a method used by former slave owners to constantly keep blacks in so much debt that they will never be able to rise out of. Another form of inequality was the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. This group of racist Southerners wore white gowns and lynched many African Americans throughout the South. This re-implemented a great amount of fear amongst the free blacks living in the South. The government wasn't able to combat this form of terror with recently passed 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment because the court cases like the Slaughterhouse case claimed that those laws only apply to federal jurisdiction, which were only places like rivers. Otherwise, the states obtained the rights to do whatever they wanted to do in order to sustain the Southern culture. For example, voting in the South was virtually impossible for blacks due to the grandfather clause and registration tests. Also, demographic shifts like the Great Migration limited the blacks' potential to climb the social hierarchy because once the blacks migrated from the South to urban centers, the Northern Democrats migrated south to avoid living equally with the newly assimilated African Americans. Moving forward to the 1950s and 60s, the oppression towards the blacks remained the same, if not worse, with segregation and the idea of being separate but equal within the legal court system. However, this thought process of only being legally equal to the whites is how segregation formed. For example, Bull Connor was a racist police chief who severely discriminated against blacks, shown by using fire hoses to physically abuse nonviolent protesters. However, the civil rights movement initiated by people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks really started to strategically contest this racism. This was a major change in the obstacles for full equality. Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent movement, mixed with full media coverage, really allowed for all of America, including the whites, to witness the oppression of minorities. Martin Luther King Jr.'s end goal was integration. However, another leader at the time, Malcolm X, wanted black culture to be completely separate from white culture, or also black separatism. Malcolm X believed that whites would never accept blacks into their society because of the context, including Marcus Garvey's return to Africa and his recent conversion to Islam. Those two leaders, coupled with things like the Montgomery bus boycott, the student sit-ins, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, really altered the perspective on how to treat minorities. Also, the women's rights movement for the 1960s legislation shadowed the blacks movement and arose around the same time because both of these groups were being oppressed and flattened by similar legislation. Women leaders like Betty Friedan brought attention to women's rights through her book, The Feminine Mystique, which discussed the cult of domesticity and the inherent sexism behind the current gender roles. These movements helped to progress the contemporary society and evolve past segregation and move toward assimilation. For example, most schools stopped segregating due to federal law threatening their funding. Also, the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 eliminated all kinds of segregation based on race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964, legalized racism through segregation and discrimination had been brought to its knees. However, just because a law was passed, the law did not change the personal views held by citizens of the country. This move away from legal discrimination and more into institutionalized racism was first highlighted by the radical black nationalists such as Malcolm X. Institutional racism is when racial discrimination becomes established in normal behavior within a society or organization. Most of the time, the discrimination is subconscious. For example, white flight shut out even these families who moved out of increasingly black-dominant neighborhoods and moved into the suburbs were not overtly racist people, but subconsciously they associated black neighborhoods with poverty, drugs, and violence. This mentally led to ghettoization of the urban centers of the country and the suburbanization of white families. What blacks faced after the civil rights legislation in the 1960s was no longer government-backed overt racism, but institutionalized racism in a system that is always suspicious of black culture and black people as a whole. The economic challenges that black people faced after the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s was urban poverty caused by the failing manufacturing economy, especially in urban centers. An example of this was the rise in poverty among urban blacks. As manufacturing jobs were outsourced overseas to places with cheap labor, these struggles escalated during the race riots of the 60s. The protesters fought against overcrowding of cities, poor living conditions, poor education, and even police brutality. All these problems can be traced back to institutional racism. Once again, even though discrimination based on race was illegal, the bias against blacks was evident in the underfunding of predominantly black schools, harassment over policing, and economic disparities. Through the 1990s and even to today, institutional racism is still alive. Most evident in the past 35 years is the militarization of the police and the distrust of young blacks, especially by the police. The drug wars of the 1980s targeted black communities, the beating of Rodney King, the shooting of Trayvon Martin. These events illustrate the continued institution of racism in this country.